out of my face, old-timer! You wouldn't last 5 minutes in my world, son!
Wait. I served.
Get out of my face, old-timer. You wouldn't last 5 minutes in my world. That's what Staff Sergeant Dylan Mercer said to a 73-year-old man sitting quietly at the end of the bar in a VFW hall in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Mercer had spent the last 20 minutes making sure every person in that room knew exactly who he was. Special Forces, recently returned from deployment, top of his class in every combat course the Army had to offer. He was loud, he was proud, and he had absolutely no idea who he was talking to. Because the old man in the faded denim jacket, the one nursing a black coffee with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since 1971, was about to say 6 words that would drain the colour from Mercer's face and drop the temperature in that room by 30 degrees. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, comment respect right now and stay with me, because this story is one you won't forget. The veterans of foreign wars, Post 8466 sat on a quiet stretch of road just off Bragg Boulevard, about 3 miles from the gates of Fort Liberty. It was a humble building, low ceilings, wood-panelled walls covered in framed photographs and unit patches from every conflict since Korea. The carpet was worn thin near the bar, and the pool table in the back corner had a slight lean that nobody ever bothered to fix. On Friday evenings, the hall filled with a familiar crowd: retired NCOs, Vietnam-era door gunners, a few Gulf War tankers who still argued about the same battle they'd been arguing about for 30 years. They came for cheap drinks, warm company, and the unspoken understanding that nobody in this room needed to explain what they'd seen or where they'd been. Everyone here had carried something heavy, and the weight showed in their eyes more than on their chests. Among them, sitting in his usual spot at the far end of the bar near the back exit, was a man most of the regulars simply called Earl Jessup, 73 years old, thin, quiet. He wore the same rotation of 3 flannel shirts over white undershirts, and his silver hair was always neatly combed, though his hands had a slight tremor that made the simple act of lifting his coffee mug a deliberate effort. He never wore a hat with a unit designation. He never displayed any medals. He never once, in the 4 years he'd been coming to Post 8466, told a single war story. Most of the younger members assumed he was a support MOS veteran, a clerk, maybe, or a mechanic who'd served stateside. A few of the older guys, the ones who'd been around long enough to recognize the particular kind of silence that Earl carried, never asked him anything at all. They just nodded when he came in, made sure his coffee stayed full, and left him to his peace. Staff Sergeant Dylan Mercer was not that kind of man. Mercer had arrived at the post about 6 weeks earlier, freshly back from a rotation in the Horn of Africa. He was 28, powerfully built, and carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the world owed him its attention. He wore his green beret tilted at just the right angle even when he was off duty. His t-shirts were always a size too small, stretched tight across his chest, and he had a habit of working his deployments into every conversation whether it fit or not. Ordering a drink became a story about hydration discipline in the field. A game of darts became a lesson in target acquisition. He wasn't hated, not exactly. A few of the younger veterans looked up to him, drawn to the confidence and the stories, but the older regulars had seen his type before, men who confused volume with valour, who measured their worth by the reactions they could pull from a room. They tolerated him. They waited for life to do what life always does to men like that: humble them eventually. That Friday night, the humbling came faster than anyone expected. The hall was more crowded than usual. A group of active duty soldiers from the base had come in after a unit function, still in their dress uniforms, and the energy in the room was louder, younger, more electric. Mercer was in his element. He'd positioned himself at the centre of a cluster of younger soldiers near the pool table, holding court like a general addressing his staff. His voice carried across the entire hall, cutting through the jukebox and the low murmur of conversation. He was telling a story about a night raid. Names redacted, of course, because he was professional about it, he reminded them, and the soldiers round him listened with wide eyes and nodding heads. He described breaching techniques, the feel of a suppressed rifle in a confined space, the smell of cordite mixed with desert dust. Then he shifted. He started talking about codes, not just radio protocols or encryption standards, but the internal shorthand that Special Forces operators used among themselves, phrases, gestures, and call signs that identified you as part of the Brotherhood without ever having to say it outright. "There's a language," Mercer said, loud enough for half the bar to hear. A code. And if you don't know it, you're not one of us. Period. It's not something you can Google. It's not in any manual. You either earned it on the ground or you didn't. He paused for effect, scanning the room with a grin that dared anyone to challenge him. Nobody did. The older veterans at the bar barely glanced over. They'd heard speeches like this before, young men drawing lines in the sand that the tide would eventually wash away. But Mercer wasn't finished. His eyes landed on Earl, sitting alone at the end of the bar, staring into his coffee. Something about Earl's silence bothered Mercer. It always had. In the 6 weeks Mercer had been coming to the post, Earl had never once acknowledged him. Never laughed at his stories. Never nodded along. Never even looked in his direction. To a man like Mercer, silence wasn't peace. It was a challenge. "Hey!" Mercer called out, his voice slicing through the room. Several conversations went quiet. "Hey, Pops, you ever serve or do you just come here for the free coffee?" A few of the younger soldiers chuckled nervously. The bartender, a retired Marine named Hank, stopped polishing the glass in his hand and looked up with an expression that said nothing good was about to happen. Earl didn't turn around. He lifted his coffee, took a slow sip, and set the mug back down with a soft click against the bar. "I served," he said quietly. His voice was dry, thin, like paper rubbing against itself. Mercer grinned and took a step closer. "Yeah? What branch? What unit?" Earl still didn't turn. "Army," he said. "Long time ago." Mercer looked back at his audience and raised an eyebrow theatrically. "Army. Long time ago. That's real specific, Pops." He walked closer, closing the distance between the pool table and the bar, until he was standing just a few feet from Earl's right side. "Let me guess. Supply? Motor pool? Mess hall, maybe?" The room had gone noticeably quiet now. Even the jukebox seemed to lower its volume, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Earl turned his head slowly and looked at Mercer for the first time. His eyes were pale blue, almost grey, and there was something in them that made Mercer's grin falter for just a fraction of a second. Something steady and ancient and completely unafraid. "Son," Earl said, "I don't need to guess what you are. I can hear it from across the room." A ripple of tension moved through the crowd. Mercer's jaw tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" Earl turned back to his coffee. "It means the loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous one." The silence that followed was absolute. Mercer's face flushed red, and the younger soldiers behind him exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Mercer leaned in closer, his voice dropping to something low and hard. "You don't know anything about what I've done. You don't know what it takes to earn this beret. You sit here every Friday night like a ghost, never saying a word, and you think you can judge me?" Earl said nothing. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a small worn piece of metal on a thin chain. He set it on the bar without ceremony. It was a dog tag, old, scratched. The text nearly worn smooth, but the format was wrong. It wasn't a standard military ID tag. The information stamped into it was minimal. A first name, a single letter, and a 6-digit number followed by a suffix that Mercer had only ever seen in classified briefing documents. Mercer stared at it. The colour drained from his face in real time, like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the tag, then at Earl, then back at the tag. "That's..." he started. "That's a..." He couldn't finish the sentence. One of the older veterans at the bar, a retired command sergeant major named Bill Taggart, who had been watching the entire exchange with quiet intensity, stood up from his stool and walked over. He looked down at the dog tag, and his expression changed immediately. He straightened his back almost involuntarily, the way a soldier's body responds to authority before his mind even processes it. "Son," Taggart said to Mercer, his voice low and absolutely steady, "do you know what that is?" Mercer swallowed hard. "It looks like..." "It can't be." Taggart picked up the tag gently, reverently, turned it over in his fingers, and then set it back down in front of Earl. "That," Taggart said, turning to face Mercer directly, "is a Spike Team identifier from MacVSOG, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, the most classified, most decorated, and most lethal special operations unit in the history of the United States military." The room didn't just go quiet. It went hollow. Every man within earshot turned to look at the thin, trembling old man sitting at the end of the bar. Taggart wasn't finished. He spoke with the measured precision of a man who had spent a career studying military history and who understood with absolute clarity the weight of what he was saying. MacVSOG operated behind enemy lines in Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia from 1964 to 1972. Their missions were so secret that the US government denied their existence for decades. They ran recon teams, 5-6 men deep into territory, where the odds of coming back alive were at times less than 50-50. They suffered the highest casualty rate of any unit in the Vietnam War, higher than the Marines at Hue, higher than the paratroopers at Hamburger Hill. And the men who carried those identifier tags, they weren't just operators, they were ghosts. The military didn't acknowledge them when they went in, and in many cases it didn't acknowledge them when they didn't come back. Taggart paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with something that went deeper than respect. The codes they used, the internal shorthand, the field identifiers, the team designations, none of it existed on paper. It was passed from team leader to team leader, face to face, because writing it down meant risking compromise. If any of those codes leaked, men died. Not might die. Died. Those codes weren't earned in training facilities or selection courses. They were earned in triple canopy jungle at 2 a.m. with a company of NVA regulars hunting you by sound. He turned back to Mercer, who had not moved, who had not blinked. That code you were bragging about, the one that makes you part of the Brotherhood? Taggart pointed at Earl. This man's Brotherhood invented it. Earl sat motionless through all of it. He didn't nod. He didn't confirm or deny. He didn't stand up straighter or look around the room for validation. He simply sat there, both hands wrapped around his coffee mug, his eyes distant as if Taggart's words had carried him somewhere far from this room. Back to a jungle ridgeline maybe, or a landing zone ringed with fire, or the face of a teammate who never made it to the extraction point. The tremor in his hands was more visible now, and the silence in the room made it impossible not to notice. This was not a man performing strength. This was a man surviving memory. Mercer stood rooted to the spot. His chest still rose and fell with the breathing of a young, powerful man, but his eyes had changed. The swagger was gone. The performance was over. Something behind his expression had cracked open, and what came through was not shame exactly, but recognition. The sudden, nauseating understanding that he had been measuring himself against a scale he didn't even know existed. He looked at the dog tag on the bar. He looked at Earl's hands. He looked at the wall of photographs behind the bar, and for the first time he saw them. Really saw them. Young faces in grainy black and white. Men who would never sit at this bar. Men who would never grow old enough to be called pops by someone who didn't know any better. The room held its breath. Nobody told Mercer what to do next. Nobody had to. He took one step forward, then another, until he was standing directly beside Earl's stool. Then, slowly, Staff Sergeant Dylan Mercer, Special Forces, top of his class, veteran of 3 deployments, did something that nobody in the room expected. He came to attention, full military bearing, shoulders back, chin up, eyes forward, and then he saluted. Not the casual half salute of a man in a bar. A crisp, textbook, parade ground salute directed at a 73-year-old man in a flannel shirt who had never once asked for it. Earl looked up at him. For a long moment, the two men simply regarded each other, separated by 45 years of history, by jungles and deserts, by wars fought in shadow, and wars fought under satellite surveillance, by everything that had changed in the military, and everything that never would. Then Earl nodded, just once, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, and that was enough. That single nod carried more weight than every word Mercer had spoken that night. It was acknowledgement without ego, acceptance without performance, the unspoken language of men who had faced the unthinkable and chosen to keep going. Mercer held the salute for a full 5 seconds, then slowly lowered his hand. His jaw was tight, his eyes were wet. He turned to the room and spoke, and this time his voice was not loud. It was barely above a whisper. "I owe this man an apology," he said, "and I owe every one of you an apology for running my mouth in a room full of men who earned their silence." Then he looked back at Earl. "Can I buy you another coffee, sir?" Earl studied him for a moment. Then the faintest trace of a smile crossed his weathered face. The first smile anyone at Post 8466 had ever seen him make. "Make it black," Earl said. "Same as always." The rest of that night unfolded differently than any Friday at post 8466 in recent memory. Mercer didn't leave. He didn't retreat into silence or embarrassment. He pulled up a stool next to Earl and sat with him, not talking, not asking questions, just sitting. After about 20 minutes, Earl spoke. Not about Vietnam, not about MacVSOG. He talked about his granddaughter's soccer game the previous weekend. He talked about the tomato plants in his backyard that weren't doing well this season. He talked about a book he'd been reading on the history of railroads. And Mercer listened. He listened the way a student listens when he realizes that the lesson isn't in the words, but in the willingness to be present. Over the following weeks, something shifted at the post. Mercer kept coming back, but the volume was gone. He stopped wearing his beret off duty. He started asking questions instead of telling stories. He sat with the older veterans, learning names he should have learned weeks ago. And Earl, for the first time in 4 years, started sitting a little closer to the centre of the bar. He never told his war stories. He never wore a medal or put a bumper sticker on his truck. But the men around him began to understand what Taggart and the other old-timers had always known, that Earl Jessup's silence was not emptiness. It was a cathedral. It was the space left behind when a man has seen so much that words become insufficient. And the only honest response to what he carried was to carry it quietly, every single day, without complaint, without recognition, without ever once needing someone else to tell him who he was. Word spread beyond the post. A local journalist who was also a VFW member wrote a small piece about the culture of the hall without naming Earl directly, but describing the phenomenon of men who served in silence and the importance of honouring them before they were gone. The article caught the attention of a retired Army colonel who had spent years working to get MacVSOG veterans the recognition they'd been denied. Within months, an official ceremony was organised at Fort Liberty. Not a large public affair, but a private gathering attended by active duty Special Forces soldiers, retired operators, and a small group of surviving SOG veterans, of whom Earl was one of only a handful still living in the state. At the ceremony, a brigadier general presented Earl with a framed unit citation and a personal letter of recognition from the Special Operations Command. Earl accepted it with the same quiet nod he'd given Mercer that Friday night. He didn't make a speech. When a young captain asked him afterward what it felt like to finally receive formal recognition, Earl thought about it for a long moment and then said, "The men who deserved it most aren't here to receive it, so I'll hold it for them." Mercer was there that day. He stood in the back row, in full dress uniform, and he didn't say a word. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, he walked up to Earl one final time and extended his hand. Earl took it. They shook once, firmly, and that was all. No speeches, no theatrics, just the grip of two soldiers who had come to understand each other across a distance that most people could never cross. Some codes are taught in classrooms and rehearsed on training grounds, and tested in controlled environments where the variables are managed and the risks are calculated. Those codes have value, they save lives, they build teams. But there is another kind of code, older, quieter, harder, that can only be written in the handwriting of experience. It is the code of men who walked into darkness without knowing if they would walk out. It is the code of silence that speaks louder than any boast. It is the code that says, "I was there, and I did what was asked of me, and I do not need you to know about it for it to have mattered." Earl Jessup carried that code every day of his life. He carried it in the tremor of his hands, in the distance behind his eyes, in the way he sat alone at the end of a bar and never once felt the need to explain himself. And on one Friday night in Fayetteville, a young man who thought he knew everything about being a warrior learned the most important lesson of his career, not from a manual, not from an instructor, not from a battlefield, but from a cup of black coffee and 6 quiet words from an old man who had already given more than anyone in that room would ever know. If this story moved you the way it moved me, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of those who served in silence, because their sacrifice deserves to be remembered, not with noise, but with the kind of respect that only comes from truly understanding what they gave. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And the next time you see an old man sitting quietly in a room full of loud voices, remember, you might be looking at the most dangerous, most decorated, most extraordinary person in the building. You just don't know it yet.